Welcome to another course module. Welcome to this course module. We already learned a lot about Angular, and thus far we really built a single page application. We used directives and so on to change portions of this page, but in the end we always were on the same page. If you looked at the URL at the top, it was always localhost 4200. Now what if you wanted to have a page where you actually display several pages? Like you have a /users or a /accounts page. Now you might think that for this you indeed need multiple pages, multiple index HTML files or something like this. But you don't. Angular ships with its own router, which allows you to change the URL in the URL bar and still only use one page, but then exchange major parts or a lot of parts of that page so that to the user it really looks like a new page was loaded because maybe only the header is the same, but behind the scenes it is still JavaScript changing a lot of parts in your DOM, in your page, making it look like a new page was rendered, but you're still in the Angular world in your single page application. Let's take a closer look in this module. Attached to this lecture you find this example project here. Now on the first look it might look nice, but it has one fundamental issue. We can't switch the pages here. We get some tabs at the top, but these tabs are not working. And therefore what we see on this home page are actually all the components I later want to split up over multiple pages, or multiple pages in quotation marks I should say, in this module. We do have a home, a servers, and a users page. And as you can see here, we got users, servers, and the home page on the same page. So that is something we can improve, but it would be nice to have separate pages as I said. So a /users page or a /servers page and so on. So this is what we're going to work in this module. And for this, we need routes. We need the Angular router, and the Angular router needs to know which routes our front-end application has. So you might know this pattern from a full stack application where you also register some routes the user can then visit. We can do the same in Angular, and we will do this in the next lecture. So here I am in the source code responsible for the app you saw in the last lecture. And as you can see, here I got 3 major components and then some subcomponents of these components. In the app component, I'm loading them all. My home component, my users component, and the servers component. For now, I'm going to ignore my subcomponents here, edit server and a single server, so we will later nest this even more. But for now, it would be nice if of these 3 components, I would only display one at a time, so that we can dynamically load them by clicking on these links here at the top, and we really load a different route in our app. Now, where do we register such routes? Let's think about this logically. These routes are responsible for our whole app. Everywhere in our application, if we enter /users, we want to load the users component as our main page, let's say. So since this is really a core part of our app, where should we register it? Well, the app module sounds like a good place, because here is where we configure our app, where we add all these components and so on. So this might be a good place to also inform Angular about the routes our application has. And it is. So here above this @ng-module decorator here, I will add a new constant and I will name it app routes because it should hold all the routes of my application. Now this routes constant should be of a specific type, the routes type, which needs to be imported from @angular-router. So make sure to add this import at the top. This is the type informing Angular or giving these routes some structure, I should say. You don't necessarily have to add it here, but it is a good practice. Now with this import added and the constant set up, what should this constant actually hold? It should hold an array because we will have multiple routes. So we add all the routes we want to set up to this array for now. And each route now is just a JavaScript object in this array. Now the question is, how should such a route be configured in an Angular app? it has to follow a specific pattern, a specific structure for Angular to be able to use it. And this structure always needs a path. This is what gets entered in the URL after your domain. This should be a string, and the first route I want to add could be my users route. This allows me to then visit localhost or whatever your domain is, 4200 in this case here, and then /users. So that is your path without the slash. And this is important. Make sure you don't add the slash here. This would be incorrect. Add it without the slash. So this is now the path, and this will later allow Angular to determine which route in our array of routes here should be selected if we enter something in the URL or click some link, because it clearly defines, well, which path this route should be. Now we also need to define what should happen when this path here is reached. Right now, nothing happens. It's a route, but yeah, there is no action attached to it. The action typically is a component, so that you inform Angular that once this path here is reached, a certain component should be loaded. And this component will then be the page, you could say, which gets loaded. So here for users, it sounds about right to load our users component, and of course it's up to you to make sure that in your application you are indeed, well, configuring your components you want to serve as pages, to look like pages, to have all the content you want to have on this page. In this case, that's the case for my users component. Here, at least for now, it will output my list of users and then the single user component next to it, and we will later improve this to also be able to select a user from this list of users here, but for now that's fine. So this is now my first route with the users component getting loaded once we target /users. Now let's add a couple of other routes. I'll duplicate this or replicate this twice. I also want to have a certain page I display once we have just localhost 4200, so an empty path after it, you could say. So we should also create a route for this with just an empty path. And here I want to load my home component. This is the starting page, you could say. You, of course, don't need to have such an empty path, but then you somehow need to handle this, well, the user accesses an empty path differently, and I will come back to this later. So for now, we have an empty path, just localhost 4200 loading the home component, /users will load the users component, and I also want to have /servers, which will load my server or servers component. With that, 3 routes are set up here, but that alone won't do anything. How would Angular know that you want to use this constant? You could have added any constant here, and the name app routes, well, that is totally up to you. So right now these routes will be ignored by Angular, and the type routes here doesn't do anything when it comes to this. So we somehow need to register these routes in our app. And we do this by adding a new import here to this imports array. We need to add the router module here, and the router module should be imported from our @Angular router package here. So with this added, we're adding the routing functionality to our app, but still our routes are not registered. That is why this router module has a special method we can call forRoute, which allows us to register some routes for our main application here. So forRoute will now receive our app routes constant here as an argument, and with that our routes are now registered in our Angular app on this router module, which gives us this routing functionality, and now Angular knows our routes. The missing piece is some place to render the currently selected component. Because if you have a look at our app component template, we still add our components here with their selector. Now, okay, we visit /users, so Angular knows we want to load the users page, but how does it know where to display it? How does it know if you want to display it here, or maybe here in the header? It doesn't know. So the right place to inform it where to load it is to get rid of all these rows here but one, so only have the place where you actually want to render your route. And now you don't add your component with its selector, but you add a special directive shipping with Angular, the router outlet. Now this looks like a component, but it still only is a directive. Keep in mind, directives may have any selector, including this component or this element style selector. And with this now simply marks the place in our document where we want the Angular router to load the component of the currently selected route. And with this all set up, if we now save this and let it rebuild therefore, we should see that this rebuilds successfully. And if we visit our page now, you see we only see the home page now. And if we now enter /users here, we see the users page. And if we enter /servers, we see the servers page. So this is working. Of course, our links are not working. This is something we will work on next. In the last lecture, we made our routing work. We added routes and we gave Angular a place to load our currently active component. But one issue we have is right now we can only navigate around by manually typing it here in the address bar. Not super convenient, and whilst it is important to be able to load a route directly from the address bar, it would also be nice to have some working links here in our navigation to have these tabs work. So let's add some links to our application. And if we go to our app component, we see here's our navigation. The first thing you might think about is, hey, we can, or we already have this ref attribute here to be precise. So here we could have ref, just slash to load our root route. Here we could have /servers, and here we could have /users. And if we now save this, we added all the routes, the paths we set up in our routes configuration to our navigation here. And hence, if this reloads and we click the tabs, hey, this is indeed working. Now we are correctly loading the route we want to load. Okay, this tab is not updated, but I will come back to this later. But the reloading is working. And that's the issue. It's reloading the app. Watch this reload icon here. Do you see this? We refresh the app with every link we click. And that's the natural behavior, because with every link we click, a new request gets sent to the server, and it returns us a new page. And since this page is still our Angular app with the routes registered on it, it is able to give us the correct route. So the same thing happens as if we entered this manually here. That, however, is not the best behavior, because it means it restarts our app on every navigation. That of course means our whole application state will be lost, and it might not really be the behavior we want to offer to the user. So this is not how you should implement navigation. How should you implement it then? There is a special directive Angular gives us. Let's get rid of all these ref attributes here. So this is not how we will navigate around. Instead, let's use this special directive. It's called router link. Now, router link like this simply is able to parse a string where we could pass just slash. So just this string slash to router link here. Now this will tell Angular that this element on which router link is placed here, this anchor tag here, will serve as a link in the end, but it will handle a click differently, as you will see in a second. Let's now also add this to the servers link, so router link equals /servers. And I will come back to how you may write the path here in the next lecture. Another way of using router link is with property binding. So you can enclose it in squared brackets. And now, of course, you can't just pass /users here, because this would now search for a property with that name, which would even be an invalid name in JavaScript. So now you have to pass a string here with single quotation marks, or better, an array, which gives you a more fine-grained control over router link. And I will come back to this later when this is especially useful. Here in this array, you now specify all these segments of your path as elements in this array. So the first segment in this case is only a string /users. And if you had /users /something, you would have a second element here, which is then just something without a slash. The leading slash here is only needed to make this an absolute path, and I will come back to this in the next lecture. For now, we'll get rid of this. Now, this array notation is not super convenient, but soon you will see when it really gives you an advantage, or when you need this notation. It allows you to construct more complex paths very easily. So with this, we set up our free links using router link, either by passing a string or this array, which allows us to define our individual path elements. With that, if we save this and have a look at our application, now you see it still reloads, or it still gives us the components, but it doesn't reload the page. If you watch this reload icon, nothing is happening there, because router link catches the click on the element, prevents the default, which would be to send a request, and instead analyzes what we passed here to the router link directive, so this path or this array of path elements, and then parses it and checks if it finds a fitting route in our configuration, which it of course does, because we defined all the paths we're using here. And this is how we can navigate around with the router link, and this actually is how we should navigate around, because it gives us the better user experience, it doesn't restart our app, therefore it keeps the app state, and it's much faster than reloading the page all the time. You can of course still type something here manually, so that will still work, but if you're inside of the app, using router link is much better. In the last lecture, we added this navigation, and I also mentioned that you can change the way you use your paths here. Right now we use //servers, or even with this more complex notation, we have /users as the first element. Now what happens if we just use servers here like this and just use users like this? Let's save this without deleting /. Now if we click there on our links, you still see this works absolutely fine, nothing changed. Now let's go to our servers component template file here, and for now let's quickly add an anchor teller element here, where we also add a router link, where I add servers again. Reload page would be a fitting description. So on this servers component, I now added this router link, where I basically want to make sure that I stay on the servers page, which I'm already on. So if we go to servers here, we see the reload page here, and if I click it, you see we got an error. This error here occurs because it doesn't find a route which is servers/servers. Now this error won't occur if on the servers component I turn this to /servers, so to an absolute path. It was a relative path. Here, if we now have our console still open and I click reload page, nothing occurs here, no error occurs, because now it simply navigates to localhost 4200/servers, as you can see down there. And if we turn this back to a relative path, the difference was that now it tries to go /servers/servers. So with a relative path, it always appends the path you specify in the router link to the end of your current path. And important here, the current path depends on which component you're currently on. That is why we could remove that in our navigation, where we also use relative paths, because that is on our root component. This component is not loaded through the router, so this root component always sits at localhost 4200/nothing. So this is always at our root level, which is why we can use relative paths here too. But one layer below that, once we loaded a route, for example the servers component, this page is only loaded if we are at /servers. So if we add a relative route here, this will now get appended to this route we're on, so it will try to load servers/servers, and therefore it gives us an error in our case, because we haven't registered a servers/servers route. Now of course, using relative paths inside of active components, active routes, might be a nice thing if you have nested routes. Right now, it will only break the app though. Now, you can also use relative paths with // at the beginning. This is the same as having nothing there. And you can even navigate around like in a folder directory. You could add // which means go up one level, and then add this to the path here. Now, if we do this inside of our servers component, you will see if I hover over this, now it again only tries to load /servers, and therefore we don't see an error. Because now it first goes back one level, which basically is to just our root path, so it removes one path. And important path depends on the route you're on. So if you were on servers/something, and this would load this component, it would remove both. So this does not necessarily only remove one segment here, it removes the currently loaded segment, you could say. So in this case, it removes this and then adds /servers again, which is why this works. And this is how you can navigate around absolute paths with a slash at the beginning, which will always get appended to the root domain, relative paths without a slash or with /, which means added to the currently loaded path, or .. and you can even add more of them, to say, well, go back one path, go back another path, so always seen from the currently loaded component on. And if that is something which is not 100% clear, you will see it throughout its module, but also feel free to play around with it, add your own routes, add some nesting, add more complex paths, and see how this works out. But for now, let's continue with our application. I will remove this reload page link, and let's enhance this a bit more. We of course added navigation to our page, but one issue is that whilst it does work fine, we get no visual indication of what the currently active route is. It would be nice if the selected tab would change, and that of course is only a CSS thing, because if you check your app component here, you see we got this active class on the list item which determines whether this is marked as active, if this link gets the right CSS classes or not. So it would be nice if we could dynamically set this class. I will remove it from here, and how can we now set it dynamically? Angular gives us a specific directive for this, the router link active directive. And the convenient thing about this directive is you can add it to a wrapping element like we do here to the list item, or also, of course, to the link itself. And it will attach the class you specify in between here, for example, active, so this should be a string, to that element it sits on. Now, active on the link itself wouldn't do anything when using Bootstrap. Here, for this tabs look, we need to add it to the list item, but this of course depends on which package or which CSS code you are using. And here you could specify any class you want, like my active class or whatever that is. So here it is active to make it look nice in Bootstrap's world, and I will add it to all my links here. So now theoretically, all my links should receive this active CSS class once they are clicked or when they are active. So if we have a look at this, it seems to work because we still have home set as our active page, even though we removed this class, this active class we had there before. If I click servers, it gets marked as active too, and the same for users, so this works. But somehow home is always marked as active, so that does not seem to work correctly. What's wrong here? Well, the router link active directive does one thing. It analyzes your currently loaded path and then checks which links lead to a route which uses this path. And by default, it marks an element as active, it adds this CSS class if it contains the path you are on, or if this link is part of the path which is currently loaded. So for the /servers link or the /users link, this is of course the case once we click servers or users. For the /nothing link, which is the first one, the home page, this is always the case. We always have /nothing at the beginning of our path here. So if we are on /users, well, there is this empty path in between, you could say. The same for servers and the same for just home, of course. So the empty path segment is part of all paths. Still, we don't want to have home being marked as active all the time. So to fix this, we can add some configuration to this router link active directive, and I will just split this up all over multiple lines to make this a bit easier to read. So we can add a special configuration to our router link active directive. So on the same element as router link active was added to, we can add router link active options. And this now needs some property binding because we don't just pass a string there. Instead, we pass a JavaScript object, and that would not work without having our squared brackets. So with squared brackets, we can pass anything which will be resolved dynamically, like this JavaScript object. And here we can basically add one important configuration, say exact, and set this to true. So exact is a kind of a reserved property on this object you pass to router link active options, and this will now basically tell Angular only add this router link active class, so this active CSS class in this case, if the exact, the full path is, well, whatever this link leads to. So only if everything is just slash and not if it is only part of the path. So with this in place, now you see it still is marked as active on the empty path at the starting page. But if you go to /servers, now only servers is marked as active because now we fixed this, we changed the default behavior to make sure we only mark this if the full path is, well, whatever we have on our router link. Whoa, we already covered quite some things. We learned how to add routes and how to load them, either by typing it manually into our navigation bar here or by clicking some links. We also learned how to style these links. But what now if we wanted to load a route programmatically? So we don't have a link the user can click, but we finished some operation or the user clicked some button and then we want to trigger the navigation from our TypeScript code. We can do this. Let's say in our home component here, I add a new button to it. And on this button, I simply want to load the server's page. So here, now we could try adding router link, but let's say I want to have a click listener and execute some method because we do something else than just navigating there. I will also add some CSS classes to make this button look nice. So on this click listener, I want to execute onload servers. And here, this method now gets implemented in the home component. And in onload servers, I simply want to navigate to the servers component. So we could, for this example, of course, also use a router link. But let's say here we have some complex calculation, or we reach out to our backend, we store something on the server, and once we are done, now we want to navigate away. To do so, we somehow need to get access to our router, this Angular router, because we need to tell it, hey, please navigate somewhere else. The nice thing is we can inject this router. So let's bind it to a private property, maybe we name it router. And this will be of type router. Router needs to be imported from @Angular router. With this injected, we can use this router here. So this router, and then we get a couple of methods there. One of the most important ones being navigate. Now navigate takes an argument which allows us to, guess what, navigate to a new route. And here a route is defined as an array of the single or the different elements of this new path. So just like here in app component, where I also explained this alternative way of binding router link, binding it to an array, where you could have users for the users part of your path, and then another element for maybe something for the something part of your path. Now you always have to pass such an array when using the navigate method, but in here still the first element is simply the first element or the first segment of your path. So if let's say we want to go to /servers here, we could add /servers here. And as before, this is now an absolute path. You could have a relative one, but here you have to control to what this should be relative to. And I will come back to this. So for now, let's make it an absolute path here. And once we did this, let's check our page here, click this button, and we go to servers. So this is now programmatically routing to a different page. Still, it doesn't reload our page. It does the same as if we clicked a router link, but with this router navigate method, we are able to trigger this programmatically, so trigger this in our code. In the last lecture, we learned how to navigate programmatically. Now I want to also have a look at how we can use relative paths there. So back in our servers component, let's say we have again our reload page link, but this time it's a button here with button primary, and still we might use this approach because we want to do some different things. So reload page, and here I will have my click listener on reload maybe. So if we now go to our TypeScript code, here on reload will be the method which gets triggered. And we already inject this service here. I also want to inject the router. So let's add router here. Make sure to add the import from @AngularRouter. So we learned that now we could say this router navigate, and now let's add /servers here. If we do this and we save this page and we go to the servers page and click reload, nothing happens. We don't get an error because we are already on this page. Technically it still reloads the page, but keep in mind it never sends a request, so this reload icon will never spin, but Angular simply determined that we are on this page, so no further action is needed. Now let's say we remove the slash at the beginning, so we turn this into a relative path, and we still are on the servers component, keep this in mind. So now if this reloaded and we click this page, we still don't get an error. And now this might be strange because before, when we used the router link, you saw that we did get an error because it would try to add servers to the end of this path. And of course, this route now doesn't exist. So why does it work fine if we use the navigate method? Because unlike the router link, the navigate method doesn't know on which route you're currently on, so to say. The router link always knows in which component it sits, in which component's template, and therefore it knows what the currently loaded route is. Now you could argue that here we also call this inside of the component TypeScript code, so it could determine where it is in, but it's just not how it works. So to tell this where we currently are in, we have to pass a second argument to the navigate method, which is a JavaScript object, and here we can configure this navigation action. Now, I will come back to this later because there are more things we can add, but one configuration is the relative to property here. Here we define relative to which route this link should be loaded, and by default this is always the root domain, which is why we didn't get an error for this servers path. Here we have to give a route though, so we don't pass a string here. Instead, the route is something we can inject here too. We can get the currently active route by injecting route, which is of type activated route, and make sure to import activated route from the @AngularRouter package too. Now activated route, like the name implies, simply injects the currently active route. So for the component you loaded, this will be the route which loaded this component. And the route simply is kind of a complex JavaScript object which keeps a lot of meta information about the currently active route. Now we can set this as a value, so this route, this injected route, for the relative to property. And now with that extra piece of information, Angular knows what our currently active route is, and theoretically you could also set this to some other route which you would have to get by some way. So here we're telling it, now our currently active route is this activated route, so relative to this route you should navigate, and then it will simply resolve all the relative paths you might have here relative to this route. So if this change in place, if we now click this button again, now we broke the app because now it again tries to find servers/servers, which doesn't exist. So great, we broke the app, but with that, you should understand how you can work with relative paths in the navigate method. You define relative to what this path should be loaded. The default is the root URL. That might be the behavior you're looking for. It might not be the behavior you're looking for. You can change it with this extra JavaScript object, second argument to the navigate method, where you have the relative to property you can set to the route you want to navigate relative to. For now, I will simply comment this out to disable this not working button and still keep the code in this example project. With the basics about routing set, let's enhance our application a bit by going back to the app module and adding some other routes to it. Let's say that besides our users route here, we also want to be able to load a single user, so to load the user component, which simply, well, gives us that single user. For that, we might want to load a user dynamically, because if we have a look at our users component, we see we get 3 users with different IDs. So it would be nice if we could pass the ID of the user we want to load in that route path. One approach would be to set up a route with user 1 and then one with user 2, and it doesn't look very optimal because it's not very dynamic, and still, how would we know inside of this component which route was loaded? Okay, we could parse the path manually, but that's not really a great approach. Instead, we can add parameters to our routes, dynamic segments in our paths. We do this by adding a colon and then any name you like for example ID. You will later be able to retrieve the parameter inside of the loaded component by that name you specify here, so by ID in this case. And the colon simply tells Angular that this is a dynamic part of the path. Without colon, only routes which are user/ID, and with ID I literally mean the word ID, would lead to this component. With a colon, users/anything else would load this component, and anything else would be interpreted as the ID. Now with this in place, we are able to load a component, the user component, with this dynamic piece sent to it. So if we have a look to this user component or at this user component, here we simply say user with ID, and now we simply have a dummy text here loaded and user name with some dummy text here. Now, for now, we won't touch this. We won't use this parameter. We will do this in the next lecture. Let's now see if we successfully reach this. So if we save this to let it recompile and we go back, we are in users. Let's add /something here. And you see the single user component was loaded. The same if we add /1 here. So this thing, the segment after /users, is indeed interpreted as dynamic. Otherwise, we would get the error that users/1 is an unknown route. It isn't, because we set it up to be a known one, because again, we added this dynamic path segment here. Now this is how we can dynamically load some route, how we can encode some data into our path. How can we get access to this data in the loaded component though? Because that, of course, is another key question. Let's take a closer look in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we created our route with a dynamic path segment. Now we want to get access to the data the user sent us, or which is encoded in the URL, I should say. So we know that we will load the user component, this one here, and we know that there will be some data in the URL for us. How can we get access to it? Well, it is in the TypeScript file where we can get access, and there we need to inject something we already injected before, the active route. So this is again on activated route, so make sure to use this type and import it from @AngularRouter. And by injecting this, we get access to the currently loaded route. Now I told you that this currently loaded route is a JavaScript object with a lot of metadata about this currently loaded route. One of these important pieces of information is the currently active user. Now you see that in this user component, I already defined a user object at the top, which is undefined for now. It should have the following structure, and it's not used right now. But we could load our user by simply, well, getting access or retrieving this parameter from our URL. So it would be nice if, let's say, in ng-on-init, when our component gets initialized, we get our user. So we maybe want to say this user equals, and now we assign it to a JavaScript object because that is the type of it, a JavaScript object with an ID and with a name. Now the value for the ID can be fetched from our route, and there we have a snapshot property, and on this snapshot of our currently active route, we have a params JavaScript object, and here we can get our ID. And now you will only have access to properties here, well, which you defined in your route parameters. So this part here, we named it ID here, so we can retrieve the ID from this params object here. Now, the name is something which is not encoded in the route right now. So maybe we should do this too. Let's go to app module and let's simply add another dynamic part here, :name. Now we also will get this as a parameter, so we can retrieve it the same way we retrieve the ID. Let's retrieve the name. And it's in the same params object because this is all part of the route which was loaded due to this path we set up in app module being triggered, which holds two dynamic pieces. And you can add as many parameters here as you want. They will all be retrievable on this params object of the loaded route. With that, we assign something to our user. Now we could go to our HTML document and output that data. So with string interpolation, here we could output user ID. It will now be set, we know that. And username maybe. Both will be available because we set it in Ention init. Now this should work, so if we save this and we target /users1 max maybe, so that we have both the ID and the name, and we hit enter, we correctly see ID 1, name max. If we change the ID to 3, we see ID 3 here. So this seems to work, and you even see that this is still marked as active because this currently active path still contains /users, which was the route for this link. So this router link active directive is still doing its job. Now this seems to be working fine. Now let me add something to it which will break it though. I'll do this in the next lecture.